Hello, everyone. Tonight, we're going to slip into the hum of a bus engine, the flicker of a fluorescent light above, and the quiet rhythm of tires on wet asphalt. Picture this: it's just past midnight, the city has gone to sleep, and a lone bus drifts through empty streets like a tired beast on autopilot. There's no chatter of passengers, no rush hour chaos, only the breathing silence of the night. And yet, there's someone else back there. A murder mystery has occurred. At least that's what people whisper. Some say the passenger in the last seat was never real. Others insist they saw him flesh and bone, buying a ticket, nodding politely to the driver, and sitting down as though he belonged. But when the bus rolled into the terminal at dawn, the seat was empty, the stub of his ticket missing, and no record of his name in the system. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you really like what I'm doing here.
And while you're at it, let me know where you're watching from and what you do, because who knows? Maybe one of you lives along this very bus route. Maybe one of you has seen the last passenger yourself. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your comfy cushions, and let's get moving tonight. The story begins with a bus line 23A to be precise. It wasn't a glamorous route, just a long and winding one that linked the outskirts of the city with the industrial zones by the river. By day, it was filled with workers, students, and retirees who clutched shopping bags. By night, though, it emptied out until only a handful of stragglers rode it to the very end. And then there was him. The driver, a man named Harlan Reeves, had done this job for over 2 decades. He was the sort of driver you could count on steady hands, a low growl of a voice, and eyes that seemed to belong more to a night watchman than a bus operator.
He had learned the rhythm of the streets, when the lights would change, where the cats would dart across, and which lonely corner always smelled faintly of diesel and wet leaves. But Harlan noticed something, and he noticed it again and again. There was always one figure slouched into the very last row of the bus, staring out the back window as though the city itself was slipping away from him. Tall, thin, with a coat too heavy for spring, and a silence that pressed against the glass. No matter the night, no matter the weather, there he was, always the last passenger. On paper, there was nothing strange about it. People worked late shifts. People had routines, and yet this passenger never seemed to step off. Not once did Harlan see him walk out through the sliding doors. At the depot, the man was gone. At the station, his seat was empty. It was as though the journey itself had swallowed him whole.
The first time Harlan mentioned it was to a colleague, another driver who ran the route before him. The man chuckled, said something about ghost riders and the folklore of night buses. It wasn't new. In London, for instance, Bus 7 once had its own ghost story about a phantom double-decker that caused accidents in the 1930s. And in Tokyo, there were rumors of cursed trains where lone passengers disappeared between stations. Transportation always breeds legends metal, and shadows tend to do that. But still, the story nagged at Harlan every time he pulled up to the terminal and walked down the aisle to check for trash or forgotten belongings. He half expected to find the man there, maybe asleep. He never did. Sometimes there was a faint smell, though not unpleasant, but odd, like old cologne, the kind bottled decades ago, mixed with something earthy damp, almost like the smell of soil after rain. Here's where it gets unsettling.
One April night, a woman boarded the bus halfway through the route. She sat in the middle, scrolling on her phone, minding her business. When she looked up at the reflection in the window, she swore she saw two shapes herself and someone sitting just behind her in the last row. She told police later that she turned her head quickly, but the seat was empty. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether her testimony is credible. Some argue it was nothing more than reflection, distortion glass, playing tricks on tired eyes. Others suggest she might have encountered something real. After all, history is filled with sightings where the line between psychology and the paranormal blurs. And then came the night when a young man, a college student, failed to arrive home. He had been seen boarding Harlan's bus at 11:40 p.m. He even tapped his transit card, but he never disembarked. His phone location stopped updating somewhere near the river, the same stretch where the mysterious passenger always appeared. His parents filed a missing persons report. Harlan was questioned. The cameras on the bus should have shown everything. And yet, well, that's a piece we'll get to later. For now, picture Harlan gripping the wheel a little tighter each night, his eyes flicking up to the rearview mirror, wondering if the shadow back there would still be waiting. Because in stories like this, there's always a shadow waiting. For a man like Harlan Reeves' routine was everything. He woke up late in the afternoon, brewed his strong black coffee in the chipped mug he'd owned since the 90s, and slipped into his faded Navy uniform. He wasn't married, never had been, though there were rumors once about a fiancée who'd left town. He didn't keep pets, either too much hair in the bus seat already, he'd grumble. Harlan lived in a quiet two-room apartment above a laundromat, the hum of dryers seeping through his floorboards like a lullaby. By 9 in the evening, he would stroll down to the depot. His co-workers described him as reliable but detached. He wasn't much for jokes, and his smile looked more like a polite wince than genuine warmth. Yet no one denied he was steady. If your kid caught the last bus, you'd want Harlan driving it. He never sped, never missed a stop, and he always kept a rag tucked into his pocket to wipe down the dashboard. The depot smelled of oil rust and hot rubber, an oddly comforting perfume to the drivers. Harlan signed his sheet, collected his keys, and made small talk with the dispatcher, who often teased him. Another night with your ghost. Reeves Harlan would just grunt, pocket the keys, and head out into the lot. The buses waited in rows like giant resting animals, their windows blank-eyed under the buzzing halogen lamps.
Line 23A was always his assignment, stretching across the city in a 90-minute loop. It was his second home, and he treated it like one. Out on the streets, the routine unfolded like clockwork. He knew the man who sold newspapers by the gas station, always packing up his stand when Harlan's bus rattled by. He knew the couple who argued in front of the bakery every Thursday night, their voices carrying through the cool air like stage actors. He knew which traffic lights were sluggish, which alleys were shortcuts for teenagers on skateboards. But the silence that was the strange gift of the night shift, no honking horns, no school buses, clogging intersections, just the sound of his own engine and the occasional hiss of brakes. Harlan used to joke with himself that he could drive the route blindfolded. And then every night came the final stretch. That was when he saw the figure. The last passenger always appeared the same way, boarded quietly, tapped a ticket or card, gave the barest nod, and headed straight for the back. Never sat in the middle, never took the front rows. Always the last seat, left side near the window. He didn't talk, didn't hum, didn't fidget. Sometimes if Harlan glanced into the mirror, he could see the faint outline of the man's jawline lit by the street lamps rushing past. And the oddest part, no one else seemed to notice him. When other passengers were on the bus, they never looked back, never shifted uncomfortably, as though someone were breathing down their neck. They behaved as though the man simply wasn't there. It wore on Harlan's nerves. He told himself it was nothing, just a coincidence, but the feeling grew sharper with time. He'd even change up his habits, slam on the brakes harder than necessary, flip the lights brighter, or cough loudly when he walked the aisle at the end of the shift. Nothing.
The passenger never moved, never reacted, and by the time the depot lights washed over the seats, the man was gone. History has its fair share of routine mysteries. Think about the case of the Sodder children in West Virginia who went missing in 1945 after a house fire. Their father swore he saw a man peering from a bus As it pulled away that very night, investigators and detectives are still debating whether it was mere grief or a genuine lead. Routine transportation, it seems, is where strange disappearances love to nest, and maybe that was the trick here too. Maybe routine had dulled Harlan into overlooking something crucial, because once you drive the same path 1,000 times, you stop questioning the bumps and shadows, you let them blur into the background. But on that spring evening, when the drizzle painted the windshield in streaks of silver, Harlan felt a shift. The man in the back wasn't just a shape anymore, he had weight.
His reflection caught longer in the glass, like it wanted to be seen, and Harlan thought not for the first time. If he's real, why does no one else ever remember him? Rumors have a way of sticking to the bones of a city, especially the kind that grow in the dark hours when buses hum down half empty streets. Along line 23A, people didn't just ride, they whispered. It started as harmless chatter, a story traded between late shift workers, a laugh shared by two teenagers who liked to sit at the front and dare each other to glance back at the last row. But soon the story of the man who never leaves spread like cigarette smoke in a closed room, thin curling and impossible to ignore. The old woman who sold tamales at the corner stop swore she saw him once, tall and pale, stepping onto the bus without casting a shadow. A construction worker claimed he noticed footprints in the condensation on the floor, even though the seat behind him looked empty. And the bartender from the Riverside pub, he said a patron once stumbled in after midnight, shaking, insisting he'd heard whispering in the aisle, except he was the only one on board. The city wasn't new to ghost tales. Back in the 19th century, there had been reports of phantom carriages rattling across the bridge, the sound of hooves with no horses in sight. More recently, a stretch of abandoned rail line on the east side was famous for the blue light, a flicker seen at 2 a.m. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether it was a trick of electricity or something more spectral. The point is, line 23A simply inherited the city's long tradition of haunted transit. But here's the odd detail: the whispers didn't stay harmless, they grew teeth. Some riders flat out refused to sit in the last row, muttering about cold draft and the feeling of someone breathing down their necks. One bus cleaner resigned after finding a scarf on the seat 3 nights in a row, the exact same scarf, beige with a coffee stain, despite locking the bus after each shift. And then there was the blackout incident. One night the bus stalled mid route, lights flickering before plunging into total darkness. Passengers screamed, fumbling for their phones. When the lights snapped back on a minute later, a man at the back was gone. His bag was still there, his receipt in his pocket, but the seat was empty. The official record said he'd slipped off in the confusion, but no one ever came forward to claim the belongings. For Harlan, the whispers gnawed at his sanity. He was a man of order, of routine, and the idea of superstition didn't sit well with him. He wanted facts, not shadows. Yet the longer he drove, the more he couldn't shake the feeling that the passengers weren't entirely wrong. Sometimes he'd glance in the mirror and swear he saw lips moving, as if the man at the back were whispering to someone unseen. Other times he'd hear a faint thump, like shoes tapping against the floor, though the aisle remained empty. The strangeness became a sort of legend, a dare passed between school kids and night owls. Ride 23A after midnight, sit near the back, and see if you make it to the last stop. Of course, legends have a way of attracting attention. One night, two amateur ghost hunters boarded the bus with cameras hidden in their jackets. They joked, grinned, recorded themselves, whispering, "If you're real, show us." The next day, their footage surfaced online, but the final 30 seconds were corrupted, eaten by static. What was visible, though, chilled viewers. Both men turned their heads at once, eyes wide, staring at something in the last row that wasn't there. Was it paranoia, a trick of tired minds, or was something truly riding that bus every night just out of reach? Harlan didn't know, but every rumor, every whisper pushed the routine a little closer to dread, and dread, once it sinks into a driver's bones, is a hard thing to shake loose. It was the ticket that broke the illusion. Up until then, Harlan could almost convince himself that the whispers were just whispers, that the figure in the last row was a trick of the glass, a shadow leaning where no shadow should. But when police found the ticket stub, things shifted from rumor to record. The incident began with a disappearance. His name was Daniel Crowe, a 22-year-old student at the community college. He boarded line 23A on a Tuesday night, heading home from his part-time job at a bookstore downtown. His roommate remembered the text on the bus now, "See you in 20." Daniel never arrived.
When his parents reported him missing the next morning, investigators traced his last known movements. Surveillance from the bookstore showed him clocking out at 11:27 p.m. Cameras on Main Street caught him walking toward the stop at 11:36. And finally, the bus depot system registered his tap in at 11:40. After that, nothing. The troubling part, no one recalled seeing him get off. Police pulled the data from the bus's electronic ticketing system. It showed Daniel had paid his fare, but when they checked the physical stubs collected that night, the stack came up short by one. Somewhere between boarding and the depot, Daniel's stub had vanished. At first glance, it seems trivial. Tickets get lost. People drop things, but the detail gnawed at investigators. Why would every other stub be accounted for except his to complicate matters? Daniel wasn't just a random kid. He was known around campus as sharp, cautious, the type to text his location and double-check locks, not the kind of person to disappear into the night without leaving a trace. And yet the record of his last act of fare paid was the only proof he'd ever been there. The historical echo was uncanny. In 1911, a London commuter named Percy Honeywood vanished on his way to work. His ticket was punched, his briefcase later found on a train seat, but Percy himself was never seen again. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether it was foul play, an elaborate escape, or something stranger. The Crowe case seemed to hum with the same unsolvable frequency. When detectives interviewed Harlan, he repeated the same story. He remembered Daniel boarding tall kid backpack slung over one shoulder. He remembered him walking toward the back. But after that, no memory, just the usual quiet hum of tires and engine. By the time the last stop rolled around, there was no Danielle. Police scoured the bus. They lifted seats, checked under panels, even inspected the crawl spaces below the floor. Nothing. The only clue was a single scuff mark on the vinyl near the rear door, too small to prove anything, too vague to ignore. The press picked it up quickly. Phantom passenger swallows. Student One headline read. Another paper used the phrase "the vanishing stub," splashing Daniel's photo, brown hair, cautious smile, across the front page. Soon the whispers about line 23A weren't just local gossip. They were citywide headlines. Harlan didn't like the attention. He was a man of shadows and routine, not one for reporters snapping pictures of his tired eyes. Yet he couldn't deny the unease creeping into his bones. When he looked in the mirror and saw the outline of the last passenger, he started to wonder, was it Daniel sitting there now? Was that what the whispers had meant all along? But the strangest thing was this. A week after Daniel vanished, the transit office did a full system check. They discovered something impossible. Daniel's fare had been logged not once, but twice, once at 11:40 and again at 12:15 miles away from the original stop. The system couldn't glitch that way. Someone or something had tapped his card after he was already gone. And that was when investigators began to wonder if the missing stub wasn't the only piece of evidence being erased. When a city tastes blood in the water, rumors multiply faster than facts. Daniel Crowe's disappearance was all anyone could talk about. And soon the bus wasn't just a bus anymore. It was a haunted corridor, a moving coffin, a rolling question mark that no one wanted to answer. Ghost stories sprouted everywhere. A waitress claimed she served Daniel's favorite sandwich the night after he vanished, only to realize she was speaking to an empty booth. A security guard swore he saw someone fitting Daniel's description walk into a downtown alley at 3 a.m., but when he followed, the alley was bare. Then there was the viral thread online, a blurry picture of bus 23A idling at the depot with what looked like a pale face pressed to the rear window. It was enough to draw in thrill seekers. People rode line 23A not to get home, but to chase the legend. Teenagers dared each other to sit in the last row and snap selfies. Podcasters interviewed passengers who claimed they felt a cold presence behind them. Amateur psychics insisted Daniel was trapped between worlds, but on the other side of the line, the skeptics sharpened their teeth. Detective Marla Jenks, the officer assigned to Daniel's case, wasn't one for ghost tales. She stood in front of the press jaw tight and declared, "This is a missing person investigation, nothing more." Her team combed the riverbanks, questioned bus riders, and checked pawn shops for Danielle's belongings. They found nothing. Transit authorities tried to squash the rumors too. They released a dry statement about isolated system errors, explaining the double fare charge, promising a full internal review. Behind closed doors, though, some staff admitted they were rattled. One dispatcher said the driver logs kept showing phantom entries sign-ins for Harlan's bus before he'd even arrived at the depot. Still, the skeptics had a point. Ghost stories don't stand in court. Eyewitness accounts are unreliable. Photos can be doctored. Human memory bends and breaks. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the sightings were genuine or just the city's collective imagination, filling gaps in the story. There was, however, one detail that didn't fit neatly into skepticism: the scarf. It surfaced again, just like before, beige, stained, folded neatly on the back seat of the bus. This time, officers collected it and sent it to the lab. Tests came back inconclusive. No DNA, no fibers to match Daniel. Nothing but faint traces of cologne that hadn't been manufactured since the 1980s. Was it a prank? Someone planting the scarf as part of the legend? Possibly, but if so, why would they do it 3 nights in a row before the police finally stepped in? Harlan, for his part, hated the ghost talk. He told colleagues that passengers were just seeing things, that Daniel must have slipped out unnoticed. And yet every night, he gripped the wheel tighter, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. He wanted the last seat to be empty. He wanted it to be just vinyl and shadows, but it never was. Some nights he swore the man at the back leaned forward, elbows on knees, like he was waiting to stand up. Other nights, the outlines seemed taller, darker, more distinct. And once, just once, Harlan thought he saw the faint gleam of glasses reflecting the bus lights. Daniel wore glasses. The tension between ghost stories and skepticism hung in the air like static. One side demanded facts, the other whispered about spirits, and in the middle sat Harlan, trapped behind his wheel, wondering if both sides were missing the truth entirely. Because the problem with ghost stories is that sometimes they're just camouflage for something worse. The investigation into Daniel Crowe's case stirred up something long buried. Missing persons weren't new to the city, but rarely did they intersect with a bus route so ordinary, so public. When detectives began digging, they found that Daniel wasn't the first to vanish along 23A. He was simply the first to leave behind a paper trail. 17 years earlier, back in 1994, a man named Leonard Briggs boarded the same line after a late shift at the factory. His co workers saw him get on. His family waited for him at home. He never arrived. No body, no crime scene, no leads. At the time, police chalked it up to voluntary disappearance, midlife crisis, runaway debt, maybe a mistress in another state.
But the similarities to Daniel's case, where chilling a ticket validated no record of disembarkation and a final sighting near the river bend. Then there was the case of Maria Alvarez in 2006. She was 19, a waitress saving for college. She boarded the bus after closing up the diner at midnight, carrying her tips in a brown envelope. Witnesses remembered her bright scarf fluttering as she climbed aboard. Like Daniel and Leonard, Maria vanished before reaching the last stop. Her scarf was later found tangled in the hinges of the emergency exit at the back. The police called it inconclusive, but her family never stopped searching. These weren't isolated tragedies. When pieced together, they painted a pattern. Passengers boarding line 23A, witnessed by others but erased somewhere between one stop and the next. Harlan remembered Maria. He had been a younger man, then still new to the route, his hair not yet gone to gray. He'd driven the bus the night she disappeared. He told police he hadn't seen her leave. That was the first time the phrase "the last passenger" whispered through the depot. The nickname stuck, even as the years rolled on. Of course, skeptics pushed back. They argued that the disappearances were coincidence. People run away, people drown in rivers, records get lost. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these cases truly connect or whether conspiracy theorists are stringing red yarn across unrelated tragedies. But there was one detail that refused to be brushed aside. Each of the missing had sat near the back, and each of their personal items, scarf, wallet, books, turned up somewhere inside the bus as though they had been peeled away from their owners. History offered eerie parallels. In 1950, an entire streetcar of passengers in Mexico City was said to have disappeared during a blackout, with only the driver found unconscious at the controls. Folklore, maybe, but stories like these feed the imagination. And for the families of Leonard, Maria, and now Daniel, folklore wasn't enough. Harlan couldn't shake the weight of it. The memory of Maria's scarf haunted him. He'd told himself all these years that she must have slipped off when he wasn't looking, that he couldn't be blamed. But the return of the legend, the whispers, the scarf on the back seat again, it all made him wonder, because if Maria, Leonard, and Daniel had all vanished the same way, then it wasn't coincidence. It was a pattern. And if it was a pattern, someone or something was making sure the last passenger never made it home. That realization, once it took root, grew like a vine in Harlan's chest. And vines, once they grow, start to strangle. Technology was supposed to bring clarity. Cameras don't lie. After all, that's what everyone likes to believe. But in the case of line 23A, the surveillance footage didn't just muddy the waters, it turned the entire case into a hall of mirrors. Detective Marla Jenks ordered a full review of the onboard cameras from the night Daniel Crowe disappeared: four angles, front door aisle driver's seat, and rear cabin. The footage was clear as day at the start. Daniel boarding, sliding his card, the faint mechanical click of the machine. He moved down the aisle, eyes on the floor, backpack straps digging into his shoulders. He walked straight to the back, slipped into the last seat. That much was undeniable. But from there, things got strange. At first, Daniel sat still, head tilted toward the window, occasionally shifting like any tired student. The footage showed headlights of passing cars, the gentle sway of the bus, Harlan's reflection in the mirror. Then around the 30-minute mark, the video stuttered, a single skipped frame. Not unusual, systems glitch all the time. But after that, Daniel's outline looked off. He was still in the same seat, but blurred.
His head seemed lower, then higher, then tilted at an impossible angle. One moment his jacket was zipped, the next it hung open. It was as if frames from different nights had been stitched together. And then came the blackout. At 12:09 a.m., the feed fuzzed into static for 12 full seconds. When the picture returned, the last row was empty. Daniel was gone. His backpack, visible a moment earlier, was gone too. The seat was pristine, as though no one had ever touched it. Investigators replayed the footage over and over. Some swore they saw a shadow move in those 12 seconds, something tall shifting across the aisle. Others claimed the static itself pulsed like a heartbeat. The transit authority dismissed it as corruption during file transfer, but no technician could explain why every other camera angle driver door aisle remained perfectly intact. Only the rear feed failed. It wasn't the first time either.
A quiet review of archival footage revealed similar glitches in earlier cases. Maria Alvarez, 2006, 12 seconds of distortion, then her scarf left behind. Leonard Briggs, 1994, the cameras weren't digital back then, but the analog tape, a sudden warping of the real audio crackling like whispers, then silence. History held a broader precedent too. In 1977, during the disappearance of Freddie Jackson in London, photographs from an airbase showed a figure believed to be him standing behind his squadron 2 days after his death. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether it was double exposure or something beyond explanation. The surveillance glitches of line 23A carried the same flavor technology, bending at the edges of reality. For Harlan, the tape was unbearable. He sat in the interrogation room while the detectives pressed play, showing him frame after frame of Daniel fading like smoke. They asked him to explain. He had no explanation. He only stared at the empty seat on the screen, feeling a cold recognition crawl down his spine, because here was the truth he couldn't admit out loud. The empty seat in the footage matched exactly what he'd seen in his mirror that night. He remembered checking just once when the silence of the bus felt too loud. He looked and the last row was empty, but in the corner of his eye, he swore the reflection still showed someone there. That duality empty seat, occupied mirror wasn't a glitch. It was a pattern, and patterns Harlan knew didn't happen by accident. The footage leaked, of course. The press aired it in grainy clips, looping the static, framing it as the bus ghost. People argued in comment sections, some swearing it was proof of the paranormal, others calling it cheap editing. But for the families of the missing, there was no debate. The only fact that mattered was this: their loved ones had boarded the bus, and the camera showed them vanish.
That kind of evidence doesn't heal, it haunts. Harlan Tate was not a man prone to storytelling. He was the kind of driver who preferred silence, letting the hum of the engine and the rattle of loose windows fill the ride. But when the pressure built, detectives circling footage, replaying headlines, blaring his own memories became louder than the questions around him. At first, he told himself he'd imagined it. Long shifts and dim streets blur together. The mind invents things to pass the time. That's what he believed in 2006 when Maria Alvarez disappeared. He swore he'd seen her reflection in the mirror long after her seat looked empty. The memory had followed him for years, like a shadow stitched to his heels. But Daniel Crowe's case forced the memory into sharper focus. He remembered every detail of that night: the rain streaking across the windshield, the faint smell of damp wool from passengers' coats, the way Daniel's sneakers squeaked on the aisle rubber as he walked to the back. And then, nothing. It wasn't an absence you could describe, more like the air thickened swallowing sound. The engine still growled, but it was muted, as though cotton had been stuffed in his ears. He glanced into the mirror expecting to see Daniel slouched in his seat. Instead, the back row looked empty, too empty, like a blank page where words had been scrubbed away. Yet in the mirror, angled just right, Daniel was still there, not moving, not breathing, just there. His face was pale, blurred, as if fog had seeped into the glass. When Harlan blinked, the reflection remained. When he turned to look directly, the seat was bare. He never told the police this. Not in 2006, not in 2023.
Because how do you admit that reality seemed to split in two on your bus? They'd call him delusional, senile, unfit for the wheel. But he knew what he saw. He knew the difference between fatigue and fracture. The strangest part, he wasn't alone. In 1994, Leonard Briggs's wife insisted her husband's colleagues all noticed something wrong with the bus mirrors. One coworker swore he saw Leonard still seated in the glass reflection, while the real aisle stood empty. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this was a shared hallucination, the power of suggestion, or something more disturbing. And there was a historical echo too. In ancient Rome, it was believed that mirrors could trap souls, shards of polished silver acting as doorways between the seen and unseen. Broken mirrors weren't just bad luck, they were said to split reality, catching fragments of people inside. Perhaps folklore, perhaps superstition, but the bus mirror had a way of playing tricks.
Harlan carried another memory buried deep that clawed its way back during sleepless nights. The night after Maria's disappearance, he'd parked the bus in the depot alone doing his post shift check. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows down the aisle. He walked past the rows of seats, counting lost umbrellas and gum wrappers, when he reached the back. There in the glass of the emergency exit window was her scarf, still fluttering as though caught in a breeze, the scarf that had already been logged into evidence. He'd slammed the door shut, refused to walk the bus alone ever again. Now with Daniel gone, the weight of it became unbearable. Maybe the bus wasn't a vehicle at all. Maybe it was a vessel. And maybe he'd been driving something far more dangerous than he'd ever realized. For the first time in 30 years, Harlan thought about quitting. But the truth pressed against his ribs like a sharp edge. What if leaving the route didn't end it? What if the bus wasn't just a job, but a sentence? That thought kept him awake, staring at the ceiling fan, listening for footsteps that never came. The story of the last passenger might have remained a string of eerie coincidences, footage glitches, missing riders, whispers in depot break rooms, if not for the appearance of the woman in red. She entered the narrative not as a suspect, but as a ghost on the margins. Detective Marla Jenks first heard about her during an interview with an elderly man named Clyde who lived near the 23A route. He claimed that on the night Daniel Crowe vanished, he saw a woman in a long red coat standing by the bus shelter, not boarding, not leaving, just watching. Clyde described her hair as jet black, her face hidden by the hood's shadow. He swore she never moved the entire time. He walked his dog, and when he turned back for one final glance, she was gone. Ordinary enough, except Clyde's description matched an account from 2006. Maria Alvarez's best friend remembered Maria texting her weird lady in red at the stop tonight. She keeps staring. That was the last message Maria ever sent, and it went deeper. In 1994, police records contained a single note scribbled in the margin of Briggs's missing person file. Witness reports woman in red coat near River Bend. No follow-up. The ink was faded, the case long shelved. 3 separate disappearances, 3 separate decades, one recurring figure. The woman in red began to take on the shape of a myth. Was she a passenger, a predator, or something older? The kind of figure folklore weaves into warnings. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether she was a real person haunting the bus line or a collective projection born from trauma and paranoia. History is thick with women in red.
In Scottish folklore, the Baoban Sith were vampiric figures dressed in crimson gowns, luring travelers off lonely roads. In South America, La Llorona is sometimes said to appear in scarlet weeping for lost children near water. Even in modern urban legends, the Lady in Red haunts hotels, theaters, crossroads, always waiting, always watching. But this wasn't folklore, it was captured when the transit authority reluctantly released surveillance footage from a week before Daniel's disappearance. She appeared, not inside the bus, but outside, lingering at stop number 12. The video showed her as a blur, tall and thin, the red coat vivid even under the grainy infrared. She stood motionless as the bus pulled away. A minute later, she was gone, as though she'd evaporated into the fog. Harlan swore he'd seen her before, too. He remembered one winter night, long after midnight, when he slowed to a stop on the empty stretch near the industrial park.
There she was, standing alone, no purse, no umbrella, no sign she wanted to board. Her eyes caught his in the mirror, sharp and unblinking. He closed the doors quickly and drove off, heart hammering. For weeks after he avoided that stop, the red coat became a fixation in the press. Some reporters called her the phantom passenger. Others suggested she was flesh and blood, a serial stalker, perhaps complicit in the vanishings, but no missing persons registry matched her description. No driver besides Harlan admitted seeing her clearly. It was Daniel's mother who gave the detail that chilled everyone. She said that 2 days before her son vanished, he'd come home late from class, agitated. When she pressed him, he muttered, "There was this lady at the stop again, in red. She wouldn't get on. She just stared." That was the last conversation they had. Patterns are easy to ignore until they repeat enough to bruise. The woman in red wasn't coincidence anymore. She was the thread tying decades of disappearances together. Whether ghost predator or omen, her presence marked the bus line like a curse, and curses, as history often shows, rarely fade quietly. The disappearances were horrifying on their own isolated tragedies, each family left with nothing but questions. But the deeper detectives looked, the more they realized that the victims weren't just strangers passing through the city. They were bound by threads that stretched far beyond coincidence. It began with Daniel Crowe's mother. In an effort to find any overlooked clue, Detective Jinx sat with her late one evening, combing through old photographs and family records. That's when she pulled out a faded Polaroid from the mid 1990s, a neighborhood picnic, kids lined up in crooked rows, mothers gossiping in lawn chairs. In the corner of the photo stood a young man in overalls, Leonard Briggs. He wasn't related by blood, but he'd grown up in the same cul-de-sac as Daniel's uncle.
It was the first connection. Then came Maria Alvarez. Cross referencing her family tree against city records, detectives discovered her grandmother once worked as a live in housekeeper for the Briggs family in 1980. Maria herself had never met Leonard, but the family's names were etched into the same local history, overlapping through addresses and employment. Coincidences pile up all the time. Cities are small worlds, but when you added in Daniel, Maria, and Leonard all tied within 2 degrees of separation, the picture shifted. It was less about who they were and more about where they came from. The press latched onto this detail. Headlines screamed bus victims secretly connected. Conspiracy forums ran wild with theories. The disappearances were targeted. Some long running vendetta, maybe even a cult cleaning up old debts. Harlan read the articles with a sick churn in his stomach.
He remembered faces now, the way Maria's grandmother once brought cookies to the depot, the time Leonard stopped him to ask about shifts, all fragments of the same tangled web. And then came the most unsettling detail of all. Daniel's mother admitted something she had never told investigators before. When she was young, she had a recurring dream of a woman in a red coat, always standing by the bus stop at the end of their street, always watching. Her father would dismiss it as imagination, but she swore the figure was real. Hearing about Clyde's testimony, hearing that Maria had texted about the same woman, made her blood run cold. Were these families cursed or chosen? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the connections were deliberate targeting, unconscious memory shaping events, or just the cruel mathematics of coincidence. But none of the families found comfort in debate. To them, the ties only made the vanishings more sinister.
There was also the matter of the objects left behind: Maria's scarf, Leonard's work badge, Daniel's sketchbook. 3 generations of loss, 3 physical remnants, each one found near the back row of the bus. Some families even claimed the objects had moved over time. Daniel's mother said his sketchbook wasn't in the evidence locker one day, then reappeared a week later, pages warped as though exposed to water. History isn't short on examples of cursed bloodlines. From the Habsburg jaw to the Kennedy curse, people have long searched for explanations when tragedy repeats in families. Some claim it's genetics, others superstition, others the cruelty of probability. The victims of line 23A, though, weren't kin in the traditional sense. They were bound by something less obvious, but just as powerful: shared roots, shared streets, shared echoes of a past that wouldn't stay buried. For Harlan, that was the most terrifying realization.
Because if these disappearances were connected by family ties, then he himself was tied too, not by blood, but by duty. He'd been the common denominator, the driver, the witness, the ferryman for every single case. And ferrymen, as the old myths say, never get to leave the river. The investigation into Daniel's disappearance had reached a plateau. Leads circled back on themselves, suspects dissolved into shadows, and the surveillance tape only raised more questions than it answered. That's when Detective Jenks received an unexpected call from the city archives. A clerk sorting through boxes destined for shredding had come across something unusual. It was a small leather-bound notebook wrapped in an evidence bag, mislabeled under a traffic accident case from 1994. Inside the pages belonged not to an accident victim, but to Leonard Briggs himself, the very man who had vanished on line 23A.
The journal was crude, ink smudged, and handwriting erratic, but the contents were unmistakably his: dates, sketches, fragments of thought. The last entries, written in the weeks leading up to his disappearance, carried the weight of paranoia. Saw her again at the stop. Red coat. She doesn't blink. Dreamed of the bus full of shadows. Woke up choking on smoke. Back seat feels wrong, like it's not made for sitting, like it's waiting. Then on the final page: if I don't come back, check the mirror. The phrase landed like a hammer. For years, Harlan had kept his reflection story, buried, certain it was madness. Now here was Leonard, decades earlier, describing the same phenomenon, the mirror, as something more than glass, a boundary, a trap. The journal also contained sketches. Most were crude, but one stood out: a figure in a red coat, tall and faceless, standing by the bus doors.
Another drawing showed a row of empty seats, except in the reflection. They were filled with dark silhouettes. Jinx studied the pages until her eyes blurred. She couldn't dismiss them as delusion, not when the accounts aligned with multiple witnesses across decades. But if Leonard had sensed something, why had no one else seen this journal before? Had someone deliberately buried it? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the journal is authentic evidence or convenient fabrication planted to fuel hysteria. Handwriting experts confirmed it matched Leonard's employment forms, but the fact that it sat misplaced for nearly 30 years gnawed at Jenks. Misplaced or hidden, The discovery shook Harlan the most. It was confirmation of the terror he'd lived with since Maria vanished, the reflection that didn't match reality, the cold sense of being watched. Leonard had seen it too. Maybe all of them had before the end. History echoes in journals like this.
In Salem during the witch trials, a man named Samuel Parris wrote fevered accounts of spectral figures, only visible in mirrors. In 19th century New Orleans, diaries told of the Lady in Red, believed to be an omen of cholera, appearing in shop windows before entire families died. The parallels weren't exact, but they were unsettling enough to suggest the phenomenon was older than one bus route. Harlan read Leonard's words again and again until one phrase dug into his chest like a thorn. The back seat feels wrong. He thought of all the nights he'd driven an empty bus, yet never dared glance directly at the last row. The way the cushion sagged as though invisible weight pressed it down, the way the air seemed colder there. Now, with Leonard's warning scrawled across the page, Harlan knew it wasn't imagination. The bus wasn't simply haunted by absence, it was hungry. Detective Jinx had a rule: you don't chase phantoms. But the deeper the case pulled her in, the more she realized that chasing phantoms might be the only way forward. The journal, the surveillance tape, the woman in red, it all pointed back to the bus itself. So one night at exactly midnight, she proposed an experiment. The transit authority wasn't thrilled. Neither was Harlan, who had reluctantly agreed to participate. But Jenks argued that if passengers kept disappearing, they couldn't sit on their hands waiting for another tragedy. They had to confront it, test it. The plan was simple on paper: ride the route exactly as the victims had. Jinx would sit in the back row, Harlan would drive, and a pair of technicians would monitor the cameras in real time from the control center. If anything strange happened, they would have proof. If nothing happened, well, at least they could rule something out. But the moment Jinx stepped into the empty bus, she felt the air tighten. The smell of disinfectant couldn't mask something older, metallic like rusted iron. She walked down the aisle, each footstep echoing louder than it should. When she sat in the last row, the cushion sank deeper than expected, almost pulling her down. Harlan avoided the mirror. He kept his eyes locked on the road, hands gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles shone white. He hadn't driven the midnight shift in months, not since Daniel's disappearance, and every second felt like sandpaper on his nerves. At first, everything was normal. Streetlights flashed by, the engine hummed. The technicians radioed in that all four cameras were running smoothly. Jinx pulled out her notepad, jotting times and impressions like any ordinary stakeout. Then the cold started. It began at her ankles, creeping up through her legs as though she'd stepped into icy water. She shivered and wrapped her coat tighter, but the chill burrowed deeper, gnawing at bone.
When she glanced at the window, her reflection looked pale, drained. She blinked hard, and in that blink she swore another face stared back. A woman's, pale lips, hood of a red coat. The radio crackled. Rear feed is stuttering, one technician reported. Signals fine on every other cam. Jinx forced herself to keep writing, but the pen scraped across the page like it was carving into stone. The air thickened, pressing on her chest. She heard something, then soft, rhythmic. Not the engine, not the tires. Breathing, heavy and slow, as though someone else sat inches away. Harlan gripped the wheel harder. He didn't want to look. He knew what he'd see if he did. But habit won. His eyes flicked to the mirror, and his stomach dropped. The reflection showed two passengers in the back row, Jenks wide-eyed, and someone else sitting beside her. A woman, red coat, motionless. Detective Harlan croaked, voice hoarse, "You're not alone." Jenks whipped her head to the side. The seat was empty. No one there, just vinyl and shadow. Yet in the mirror, the woman sat inches away, staring straight ahead. The radio erupted with static. Feeds gone, rear cam is gone. Jinx slammed her notebook shut, heart thundering. She stood intending to move up the aisle, but her body froze mid step. It felt as though invisible hands gripped her shoulders, pinning her down. Her breath clouded in the cold, her pulse frantic in her throat. Harlan shouted her name, voice echoing through the hollow bus. In the mirror, the woman in red slowly turned her head toward him. That was when Jinx screamed, not because she saw the woman, but because, in the reflection, it wasn't her own face looking back. It was Daniel Crowe's, pale, frozen mouth open in a silent plea. Then the lights flickered. The bus plunged into darkness for 3 seconds. When they came back on, Jinx was standing in the aisle, gasping, notebook clutched to her chest. The back row was empty. The woman was gone.
But the seat cushion was still indented, as though someone invisible lingered. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this was a genuine paranormal encounter or a psychological breakdown under stress. The footage, of course, corrupted during the blackout. No proof, just another story. But for Jinx and Harlan, it was no longer about proof, it was survival. The midnight experiment had shaken everyone. Jinx returned home that night with trembling hands, unable to sleep, unable to scrub the memory of Daniel's face staring back at her in the mirror. For Harlan, it was confirmation of what he dreaded for decades. The bus wasn't haunted in the way people told campfire stories. It was something worse. It was a threshold. The idea for the mirror test came a week later. The technicians, embarrassed by their failure to capture clean footage, insisted on another attempt, this time with more equipment, more control. But Jinx wasn't interested in another doomed ride.
She wanted to isolate the variable that tied every account together, and that variable was always the same in the mirror. So the plan was simple: take the bus off route, lock it in a controlled environment, and place cameras not on the passengers, but on the mirrors themselves. They installed high definition recorders, thermal sensors, even an experimental spectrograph on the depot floor. To eliminate bias, they set up a volunteer rotation, driver's officers, even a skeptical journalist, each spending 1 hour seated in the back row while the cameras rolled. The first hours were uneventful. The volunteers reported boredom, goosebumps, nothing more. But when Harlan's turn came, the atmosphere shifted. He sat in the driver's seat, hands folded in his lap, staring into the broad rectangular mirror above the aisle. At first, he saw only his own tired eyes. Then slowly, another figure bled into view in the glass, a tall silhouette behind the last row. He blinked, looked back physically, and saw nothing. But in the mirror, the figure grew clearer, sharper. A woman in red, her face still obscured by shadow. The thermal sensors picked it up too. A sudden cold spike in the back row, dropping 15 degrees in under 30 seconds. One camera captured faint condensation curling from the seat cushions as though the vinyl itself exhaled. Jinx watched the monitors from the control room, her stomach tightening. Then came the strangest detail of all: the spectrograph registered frequencies, low vibrations that translated into waveforms resembling speech. When slowed down, a single word repeated, "stay." Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this was real communication or simply machine error, but those in the room swore they heard it with their own ears. A low female voice layered with static whispering through the air vents. Harlan gripped the wheel as though anchoring himself.
She doesn't want us to leave, he muttered. She never wanted them to leave. And then for the first time, someone else saw it too. The skeptical journalist who'd mocked the entire operation suddenly froze mid-sentence. He stared at the mirror, face pale, and whispered, "There's someone sitting next to me On the monitor, the seat beside him was empty, but in the mirrors, clear as day, sat Daniel Crowe. Same jacket, same backpack strap across his chest, eyes hollow, skin gray. The journalist bolted from the bus, nearly tripping over the steps. The mirror held the image for one beat longer, Daniel staring unmoving before the reflection flickered and went blank. Afterward, the room was silent. The journalist refused to return. The technicians refused to explain the readings. Harlan refused to look into any mirror at all. History has stories of mirrors as gateways. In Victorian England, it was custom to cover mirrors after a death to prevent the soul from being trapped.
In parts of Asia, mirrors are believed to house spirits who mimic the living waiting for an opening. Perhaps the bus's mirror wasn't reflecting reality at all. Perhaps it was showing what lay beneath it. Whatever it was, one fact became clear: the mirror didn't just watch, it beckoned, and it had been beckoning for decades.
The city wanted it over. Too many headlines, too many conspiracy theories, too much fear in the neighborhoods where the 23A still rumbled each night. Parents refused to let their kids ride it. Passengers filed complaints demanding reroutes. The bus wasn't just transportation anymore, it was an omen. So the transit authority made a quiet decision: retire the vehicle, decommission it, strip it for parts, and bury the legend in a scrap metal and rust. No public announcement, no farewell ride, just silence. But for Harlan, silence wasn't enough. He couldn't let it end without an answer. He'd been behind the wheel for every missing passenger, every glitch, every whispered rumor. If anyone had to see it through, it was him. He volunteered for the final ride. Detective Jenks tried to stop him. She argued that the experiment already proved too dangerous, that one more trip was suicide. But Harlan only smiled a tired smile. "I've been driving this thing my whole life," he said.
If it wants me, it can have me, but I'm not letting it take anyone else. That night, the depot was nearly empty. Rain hammered the roof, pooling in oily puddles. The bus sat in bay, four engine idling headlights, casting long, pale beams across the slick concrete. It looked ordinary, just a machine, but the air around it carried weight, a tension that made every sound sharper, every shadow deeper. Jenks insisted on coming along. She refused to let Harlan face it alone. They boarded together, footsteps echoing on the hollow floor. The back row seemed to wait for them, cushions sagging as though already occupied. Harlan drove. The familiar route unfolded outside the bins by the river, the skeletal street lamps, the empty stops. No passengers, no chatter, just rain and engine noise. Jenks kept her eyes on the mirror, notebook in hand, breath shallow. At first, nothing happened. No glitches, no shadows, just the monotony of asphalt and rain. Harlan almost let himself believe it was just a story after all. Then the temperature dropped. Their breath fogged, the windows iced at the corners. The hum of the engine deepened, warping into something low and resonant. Harlan's hands ached against the wheel. Jenks scribbled times and temperatures, her handwriting jagged from the tremor in her wrist. And then the mirror shifted. At first, it was subtle, a flicker, a faint blur in the last row. Then suddenly the seats filled not with bodies, but with reflections. Daniel, Maria, Leonard, dozens more faces Harlan didn't recognize, all staring ahead with vacant eyes. The woman in red stood among them, towering her hood, casting her face into shadow. "Don't look," Harlan whispered, even as his own eyes locked onto the glass. Jenks did look. She saw herself in the reflection, but not sitting in the front. She was in the back row, wedged between Daniel and Maria, her mouth open in a silent scream. The bus shuddered. Lights flickered. The speedometer twitched wildly, though the wheels barely turned. For one terrifying instant, the road outside dissolved, replaced by endless darkness. The headlights illuminated nothing but a void. Jinx clutched the seat. It's trying to pull us in. She gasped. Harlan pressed the accelerator, fighting the drag of invisible hands. The engine roared. The bus lurched forward, tires squealing against asphalt that wasn't fully there. The mirror showed passengers pressing closer, their faces pressed against the glass mouths, moving in unison. Stay, they whispered. Stay. Harlan's pulse hammered. He thought of every night he'd driven this route, every soul who never made it home. Maybe they weren't gone. Maybe they were trapped, endlessly circling in a reflection that wasn't theirs. With a guttural cry, he slammed the heel of his fist against the mirror. The glass splintered. The moment it cracked, the reflections screamed a sound like shattering metal, like dozens of voices tearing free at once. The bus lurched forward, headlights blinding, and then the road returned, asphalt, rain, street lamps, just a bus again. The mirror hung fractured, spiderwebbed with cracks. Empty, they pulled into the depot at dawn, trembling, exhausted, unable to speak. The bus was silent, too silent. Harlan stepped off first, his legs weak. He looked back one last time. Through the shattered mirror, he thought he saw her, the woman in red, still standing, still waiting, but only for a second. Word, count 1, 512. Waiting for continued. Perfect. We're stepping into the last piece. Part 15, the hidden ledger from the outline. Part 15. For weeks after the final ride, the depot stayed quiet. The bus was cordoned off, its cracked mirror draped in a tarpaulin awaiting dismantling. Harlan avoided it entirely, keeping to himself. Jenks buried her nose in paperwork, but every night she dreamt of the back row faces, staring lips, moving silently. It might have ended there, another mystery left to rot in the scrapyard, but then came the ledger. A janitor found it by accident, cleaning out an old office long abandoned in the archives building. Tucked behind filing cabinets coated with dust was a leather-bound book, its spine-cracked pages yellowed. On the cover, Route 23A incidents. Inside, line after line of names, passenger logs, complaints, reports. Some were mundane lost wallets, arguments, drunk riders, but scattered throughout were darker entries. Disappeared during transit. Family reported missing last seen boarding bus. Driver resigned, citing the red woman. The earliest entry dated back to 1956. Jenks read through it for hours, her stomach tightening with every page. The handwriting changed across decades, but the pattern didn't. Missing passengers, always the same route, always described in one chilling phrase, last seen in the mirror. One note in particular stood out, dated August 17th, 1963, written by a supervisor named Harris Driver, claims bus refused to stop. At designated point, mirrors showed additional passengers not accounted for. Recommend mirror replacement. Replacement completed September. Driver never returned to duty. Harris's note had a final underlined phrase: if the bus chooses you, it doesn't matter who drives. The ledger revealed another truth, too. The bus Harlan drove wasn't the first. 3 different vehicles had carried the same number 23A over the decades. Each had suffered the same glitches. Each had been retired quietly. Yet the disappearances continued. That's when Jenks understood it wasn't the machine. It was the route. The stretch by the river, the bend by the skeletal street lamps, the shadowed stops, all of it was just theater.
What mattered was the space the bus entered when the mirrors aligned, when the air dropped cold, when the faces appeared. The bus was a vessel, not the source. The ledger confirmed it in shaky scrawls, buried by supervisors who feared public panic. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the ledger proves a cover up or simply mass hysteria recorded on paper. But for Jenks, it was undeniable. The mystery had roots older than she imagined. When she brought the ledger to Harlan, he refused to read it. He only asked one question. Did it ever end well for anyone? Jinx didn't answer. The bus was eventually stripped, its frame melted into scrap, its cracked mirror shattered and buried, but the ledger remained locked, in evidence its pages whispering that nothing had really ended at all. And sometimes on stormy nights, Harlan swears he still hears it, the hiss of brakes outside his house, the faint glow of headlights through his curtains, a bus idling, waiting.
He doesn't look out. He knows what he'll see if he does, a reflection waiting for him to climb aboard. The story closes here, but not with relief. The case of the last passenger lingers threaded it with unanswered questions, a trail of faces, staring from a mirror no one dares to hang. So tonight, as you sit there with your own reflection nearby, think about this. If a mirror can show you what's behind you, what else might it show if it wanted? And if one night you see someone sitting next to you who isn't really there, don't wave, don't smile, don't blink, just turn away. Tonight's story leaves us staring into something we rarely question, our own reflections. A mirror is supposed to be harmless, a piece of glass with silver painted on the back.
But what if it isn't? What if every reflection we've ever trusted is hiding someone else, waiting for the moment we stare too long? The ledger suggests the last passenger wasn't just a quirk of one bus, one driver, or one unlucky night. It was a cycle, a route that chose people at random, drawing them into a place they couldn't escape. The drivers changed the buses, changed the city itself, changed, but the missing names remained. Some mysteries fade with time. They lose their edge blur into rumor and eventually dissolve into history books. But others stay sharp. They linger in the corners of our memory, flickering like headlights in the rain. And maybe that's why this story still holds power, because it doesn't just ask what happened to Daniel Crowe or Maria Cortez. It asks what might happen to us, to anyone, to you. So the next time you're alone on a late night ride, staring at your reflection in a darkened window, remember the 23A. Remember the voices whispering, stay.
And if you ever see someone in that glass who shouldn't be there, don't look twice. Some passengers never get off. Now close your eyes, take a slow breath, and let the image fade. Tonight's journey has ended.